All righty. Well, thank you all for coming out on a chilly fall evening to hear OSU, Ohio State University PhD candidate Rachel Stewart talk about vampires, the long shadow from Victorian times to today. A few programs I'd like to highlight quickly. This coming Wednesday from 6 to 8 is a Bridgerton party, a night of trivia, discussion, crafts, all around Bridgerton, and costumes are encouraged. Come back next Monday for OSU Ghost Stories to hear all about the ghastly and ghostly encounters at OSU. And October is going out on a high note with a special silent version of the movie The Shining with a live band on October 31st at 6:30 on Friday, a special after-hours program. Rachel Stewart is a PhD candidate studying Victorian popular fiction and culture with expertise in horror and the Gothic and a special love for vampires. Her dissertation focuses on depictions of the embodied supernatural within 19th century culture, merging studies of monstrosity, medical history, and print culture in order to carve out a history of body horror within the Victorian period. She has also written on how we can read trauma as vampire in contemporary genre fiction, as well as engaging with recovery work on understudied female Victorian popular fiction authors such as Florence Marryat. Let's give a big hand to Rachel Stewart.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just step on up here. We'll see how long the cardigan lasts. I thought it was appropriate, but, we'll see. Once I get talking, I get a little hot. Okay, first off, let's see if I can do this right on my first go around. Yes, okay. So first of all, before we even get started, I wanted to do a very quick little roadmap just so you know what you're getting yourself into for the evening, and so you can kind of keep yourself on pace. So we're starting with the beginning, which is going to be your classic vampires. Obviously, we've only got an hour, so there's only so much that I can go over in a certain amount of detail. So because my specialty is the Victorian era and in Victorian vampires, specifically in Victorian horror, I am going to be focusing the most there in the beginning, but there is a lot of vampire literature and culture that happens between the 1900s and the 1950s that I just don't really have as much expertise to cover, so I thought I should stay in my lane and stick with the more Victorians to begin with. Then we'll move along to when vampire literature begins to modernize, and just usually in any sort of literary history. 1945 is usually the soft cutoff of when we look to what we call modern fiction. So then we'll look at a few examples from there of how the vampire moves towards modernity. Then we will end with the vampire now and the vampire of the future, kind of where we think we're going, the current state of it. And, what's the vampire of tomorrow going to be? So first, who am I? Who's even giving this little talk? So I'm a PhD candidate in English literature at OSU. I'll be graduating in May of this year, so I'm finishing up my dissertation. My areas of study and scholarship is Victorian, and I put 1800s because I know that even before I started being a Victorianist, I still would get the things confused where you say 19th century, but it's the 1800s. That's very confusing, and I still think it's confusing, so I like to just say just the 1800s. Fiction and culture, even though my PhD is gonna be in English literature, I do a lot of cultural studies as well, especially with pop culture. There's a lot of things that maybe wasn't considered literature of the time, but I study. For example, right now I'm looking at some anti-vaccination pamphlets from the Victorian era, so that's part of my study, even though that's not really considered literature. So in general, I really like to study popular culture. I see it as a social history of the time, and I think the literature and just writing of the time really reflects that. Also the Gothic, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but more specifically, and what I'm doing in my dissertation is kind of trying to carve out where the Gothic and horror merge and then where they diverge. So I'm looking at things that maybe aren't your traditional Gothic stories that you've heard of, but are definitely trying to tap into more of this modern horror feeling that didn't get studied as much by academics because it feels kind of more like modern horror, so it's looked at as less literature, more just kind of horror schlock, and I want to bring it to the forefront. So with that I'm also doing some medical history work in there. That's not what you came to hear about, though, so I will stop talking about that. And the most important part about me is, of course, my cat. And she is named Scully from the X-Files, a la Dana Scully. And this is her Halloween costume for this year. We got it on her for about, like, maybe 3 seconds if I'm being generous. So I was ready and waiting to snap the picture, and I got it. So I've been showing literally everyone this month. So I had to put it there. I'm like, you're gonna be seeing me this whole night. You don't need any more, pictures of me. But I guess I will also embarrass and point out some special people in the audience that are here. My mom's here. Raise your hand, Mom. My mom's here, and my mom's friend, who's also kind of like, like an aunt to me, Marilyn, and then my boyfriend Noah is also here, my press agent. So get in contact with him if you want to know anything, you just set up anything. No, mostly he was here to carry everything and carry my laptop in case I needed it. All right. Enough about me, now to the vampires. So first, I do want to start with just like, what is a vampire, or what I'm considering a vampire. In my scholarship, you might think, you probably have an idea of what a vampire is, and like anything in academia, it's argued about, and everyone thinks they're right. So I'm not saying I'm right, I'm just gonna say, when I'm talking about vampires tonight, I am talking about our idea of this traditional vampire, yes, that comes from Slavic folklore, but we're going to take this more general view of generally a blood-sucking creature. From folklore and from Slavic folklore, which is where we get the Western conception of a vampire, there are vampire-like creatures in quite literally every culture throughout history. And it's really interesting the ways in which they are similar. By vampire, I mean some sort of blood-sucking creature. I just finished a book last night that talked about a Mexican witch who is a blood-sucking witch, and that's where she gets her powers from. So we can definitely, read that as a vampire, even though in their culture they were not using that word for it. But mostly, especially in the folkloric nature of the vampire, and basically any sort of supernatural creature you see in folklore, they're used as a way to make sense of the world. Both the world and also a lot of biological processes. Obviously at the time, medicine and science was not what it was now, but these things were still happening to people's bodies, and it was really scary to see these weird things happening to bodies, especially the bodies of someone that you once loved and was really important to you, and then it's doing this weird thing after death, and suddenly it's not the person that you thought you loved anymore. So they didn't know what to make of it, so we tell ourselves stories to make sense of it and to make ourselves feel better. And because of that, they needed someone to blame or some theme to blame, and I mean, they didn't even know germs existed, so that couldn't be the monster. So there are folklore that starts to crop up of, okay, well, this always was, my wife that I loved. It was a different creature that came in and changed them or made them into this other thing. So I always just try to emphasize that in order to not look at people in folklore or in olden times who believe these things and just, be like, oh, haha, simpleton, didn't know what a germ was. Well, of course they didn't. Like, it literally did not exist to them at the time. It's not because they were stupid or backwards or anything. It was just the way that they made sense of the world. And we do the same thing, just with more knowledge. So like I said, it's present in cultures worldwide. I think a lot of that just comes from the way that blood is used as this scary thing that yet we all are so familiar with and so intimate with, that, again, we have to kind of make sense of it somehow. So traditionally, we think of vampires feeding off blood. However, I'll mention one during our talk today. There's also what's considered psychic vampires, who are vampires that feed off of life energy. If you watch the show What We Do in the Shadows, that just recently stopped airing, there's a psychic energy vampire in there, something that I've actually written about because I find them really fascinating. So I always just say they feed off life force, whether it's biological life force, blood, or some sort of other energy force. One thing that's also important to understand about the vampire, and rather than just kind of the what does it do that I always try and mention, is that they really occupy and kind of embody this idea of liminal space, or the space between, in many different ways, but just a few. They're both human and inhuman. A lot of times you're human and then you get turned into a vampire and you become something else that's inhuman. A lot of times you can't tell if they're a vampire at first. They look so human. They're both alive and dead in some way. A lot of times vampires are sexually ambiguous, where even if they're not explicitly coded as gay or queer in some way, we are to understand that they are, or that's part of their kind of monstrosity, especially in the Victorian era. And also, they are all from the past. The vampire, because of its immortality, it stretches into the future. So it might be someone that's thousands of years old, so they're from the past, they're in the present, but then they're also going to outlive you far into the future. So there's also that liminal space of time. Okay, now it is time for the cardigan to come off. So one moment while you look at these pictures. Okay, I probably will definitely step on that, but it's fine. So from the very beginning, and bear with me, I promise you, if you're seeing 1816 and you're like, please, I came to talk about Twilight, like I don't want to listen to you talk about the 1800s. I promise you I will make it as interesting as possible, and the Victorians were weird, right? I promise you they were writing weird stuff, they just tried to hide it as their history went on. So this, and you can't not mention this, because this is the very first piece of vampire literature written in English. Again, my specialty is English literature, and there's always different cultures that maybe we haven't translated it yet, or just dates of prominence and things are hard to come about, or who knows if something was written before this and burned to the ground and we don't have any record from it. So I don't always like to say definitively, but as we know, this is the first piece of vampire fiction written in English. It was written by John Polidori, who is the personal physician to Lord Byron, which we will talk about Lord Byron a little bit more on the next slide, because he's kind of so important to vampire history. He needed his own slide. However, this was written as a part of a very famous storytelling contest in 1816 among some friends, but they were very literary friends, who could see who could write the scariest story in one night. So in the same night, our very first vampire tale was made, and also Frankenstein was written. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein at this same event. They had a challenge of who could write the scariest story to scare everyone else, that night. And so it was him, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and then her husband, Percy Shelley, who at the time was not her husband yet. But they all wrote things here. Lord Byron also wrote sort of a vampire tale at the time, but it did not actually come together and become published. However, John Polidori's did. However, as you can see in the picture, this says by Lord Byron, because when this came out, it was incorrectly attributed to Lord Byron upon first publication. That is some really juicy Victorian drama that I have gone through and read like editor's notes back and forth, because nobody believed either of them. Lord Byron came out and said, this is a stupid vampire story, and I would never write a stupid vampire story. Like, I'm a poet. I would never write something so scandalous. That wasn't me. And the editors were like, no, I think it's you. And they just didn't believe him. And then John Polidori came forward and said, no, it's me. I wanted to publish it anonymously just because I haven't really written a lot, and vampire stories are seen as childish or whatever. And they were like, no, you didn't. It was Lord Byron. So there was this whole back and forth. Eventually, he was believed, or they had enough people come forward. It was literally like a trial. Like, people had to say, like, I saw him writing this story. I saw him editing it. I'm the editor. It was a whole thing, and even still, certain people did not want to believe it afterwards. So eventually, it was printed with John Polidori's name on it, but that was a whole journey to get there. And our very first vampire, Lord, I say Rithen, but I have heard everyone pronounce it so differently, because it sounds like it's supposed to say Ruthven, but I honestly have no idea. So I am not the one to ask how to pronounce that correctly. But you will see the traits of our Lord are very similar to basically every vampire to come after, which is something that has always attracted me to vampires and to study them, is how have they stayed so consistent through the years? Because he is handsome, he's a very wealthy nobleman that kind of shows up out of nowhere, doesn't really matter where he's from because he's wealthy. He's like, I'm wealthy and charming, so you don't care where I'm from. He is predatory to young women. It's a short story. I will tell you, like, if you want to read it, it's important to read and be able to say, like, I've read the first vampire story ever. It's very boring. I'll tell you that right now. It is not one that I read and I'm like, oh, I can't wait to read this again. And every time I teach it, I always have to tell them that too. I'm like, I need to teach you this, but you're gonna be a little bored. Like, because it is definitely written in the terms of a man in 1816 who was around this very literary crowd. So he is not writing this like some of the more popular works at the time were, where they're meant to be, really snappy and really exciting. He's writing this very literarily. So it's a little bit of a slog to get through. But, Project Gutenberg has it, so if you want to just Control F and search for the good part where he's tearing open the throat, more power to you. And again, here we have Lord Rhythm's, he attacks the narrator's sister. That's basically the whole plot of the short story is Aubrey, the main character and narrator Aubrey, has a younger sister who becomes enthralled with Lord Rhythm, and he keeps saying, oh, he seems a little suspicious, like I don't think you should trust him. She's like, oh, brother, why bother? And then she dies. And then they figure out that he is a vampire at the end. And based on his descriptions and based off of some of the detective work that comes into the end to figure out what exactly he is, they say that he appears to have come back from the dead. Again, it's very vague as to what that means. We don't get a lot of the kind of concrete things in vampire stories. That will come in another work that I'll talk about. And again, I'll emphasize, we do have tearing open the throat and draining blood, but we have no mention of fangs. There's no mention or even allusion to him having any different teeth than you or I might. So that is not something that was there from the beginning in vampire history. They had just a normal set of chompers like you and I. But understandably and importantly, they existed in folklore. This was not like he wrote this and people did not know what vampires were or had no idea what it was. Even in the story itself, the characters put these pieces together and understand that he's a vampire because of the folklore surrounding them. The townsfolk, the peasants of the town are the ones that first put it together. They're the ones that kind of call him out as being a vampire. And this is a trend in especially Victorian literature where the folk will know what's happening and kind of be on the up and up, and they'll say, that's a vampire. And then the wealthy, more metropolitan will say, oh no, like you're crazy, you're just a poor peasant, you don't know. And then the vampire is actually real, which is again, this really interesting kind of class dynamic at play that comes into a lot of these vampire stories. So I mentioned Byron, and so Lord Byron was John Polidori was Lord Byron's personal physician, and Lord Byron is a very famous poet from the Romanticist and Victorian era. However, he's more important and more kind of remembered as, dare I say, an influencer. He was kind of this hotshot celebrity. A famous quote from the time of one of the many women that he courted said that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And Polidori came out and explicitly said that he based his vampire on Lord Byron. So we kind of have this figure that's called the Byronic vampire. We also have Byronic heroes, which also became a term used in some English academia to describe people like Mr. Rochester, where you kind of have the dark brooding hero, except here we have them, but they're vampires. So he was a poet, but he was also a notorious libertine, which is the Victorian word for someone who slept around a lot and made it very apparent to everyone what they were doing with both men and women. Then he would write many poems about these sexual conquests, wrote many sword poems where he does not leave it to the imagination what he's talking about and what he thinks about himself. And then from that, huge ego, but of course nobody understands him, because how can you understand someone like Lord Byron? So he has to brood about it, he's irritable, can't stay with a woman for too long, never acknowledges any of the children that he probably fathered. The only legitimate child that he ever acknowledged was Ada Lovelace, who is oftentimes, and I'm sure people who know more about this history would be like, oh, that's an oversimplification, but she's often called the world's first computer programmer. So when she gained notoriety and gained fame, of course he was like, oh, well, that's my daughter, actually. I will claim her. So something came from it, whatever. Again, there is so much that we know about him in terms of people that he surrounded himself with that it is not an exaggeration. Like all of these things, like everyone says, yeah, he was as bad as it seems. And This then influenced vampire literature, and so a lot of the vampires that you're probably familiar with, he's gonna come up in the very last slide that we have from vampires of today, where we still have the Byronic vampire, who are mysterious, sexy, and romantic. They have a tortured soul. They always yearn for human women who will never understand them. Some really classic examples that are explicitly Byronic vampires, because there's always that line of, you could say that every male vampire is a Byronic vampire, but the ones who really have that true tortured soul, we've got Edward Cullen from Twilight, Damon Salvatore from The Vampire Diaries, and then Angel from Buffy, which I'm repping. I know that there's multiple vampire love interests in Buffy, and many people say that Spike is also a Byronic vampire, but I would argue that Angel is more so the Byronic vampire. So, that's an argument we can have in the Q&A if anyone wants to go on Spike's side. So then we come to Varney the Vampire, who we're gonna say it's by James Malcolm Ryder, but this was, to sum it up succinctly, this was Victorian trash fiction, so we don't actually really know who wrote this. It was not attributed to anyone upon publication, or if it was, they just kind of slapped names on it. We're pretty sure this had at least 2 authors. The other one we think is another Penny Dreadful writer that they just kind of like tapped in to finish the end, but we don't truly know. It makes some of the research easier because you don't even have to consider what's the biography of the author? I'm like, we don't even know. I'm just gonna move on to the text. So I'm not mad about it. But Penny Dreadfuls in general, they were super cheap, sold for 1 penny, hence the name Penny Dreadfuls. They were considered incredibly lowbrow, popular serial literature. Their heyday was the 1840s, and then they spanned until around the 1860s to the 1870s. So we're in the mid-Victorian era now. We're a couple decades after John Polidori's The Vampire. So The Vampire is now well known enough to get the honor of being in this trash fiction. It almost always included something supernatural or something horrific in some nature. Interestingly, the equivalent of this in America was considered dime novels, but dime novels were far less interested in the supernatural. American fiction at this time was far more interested in the cowboy, adventures, kind of Rough Rider sort of situations, a little bit more on the detective side. But England was all about the doom and gloom, so they had Varney the Vampire. There's also a werewolf, Penny Dreadful, called Wagner the Werewolf, and it's also really interesting. This guy makes a Faustian bargain with a wizard, and then he becomes a werewolf so he can have immortality. But they're honestly really fun. They're bad. I'm not gonna stand up here and tell you that these are great works of literature or anything at all. They are absolutely bad, and they're almost all 1,000 pages long. So it's also not something that I would say, just pick up and breeze through in a night. But they're really, really interesting. And again, I find them interesting because this is what people were actually reading. This is not what people were reading just to tell someone that they're reading it. This is what people were actually reading. This is people who had change for the first time to spend on leisure activities. I won't bore you with the whole history of it, but there's a whole history of leisure time that's happening right now, where people were having time to do something other than work or survive for basically the first time in history. So it was really exciting for them to have access to entertainment and pop culture like this. So the fact that this is what they were reading tells us a lot about the people of the time, of why did they want to read this? Why was this entertaining to them? What was it tapping into? What fears or anxieties? Why was this thrilling to them? So that's why I really love studying it. And they were paid by the line, which I know that's a common refrain about a lot of books in the Victorian era. People say oh, that's why Charles Dickens wrote so much. He wrote so much because he had a huge ego, and so he thought that he needed to write that much. I love Charles Dickens, so I'm allowed to say that, but he definitely just had a huge ego. They were actually paid by the line, so that's why they would just go on endlessly, and even if one author would be done with the story, they'd say, tap them in, you're next, we gotta keep this thing going. So because of that, there are inconsistencies in verb tenses. Some chapters are in present tense, some chapters are in past tense. The setting is different. Sometimes it's in England, sometimes it's in Romania, sometimes it's unclear where, just somewhere in Europe. The time period's different. There's different years that we have set up across, and it's not oh, it's a different time period because it's so long. No, we'll skip decades within 2 chapters. Characterization is totally different. Varney can be a total monster one chapter and then be this tortured soul the next. It's totally inconsistent, but there are some things that do stay consistent, so that's kind of interesting to study. I just finished a dissertation chapter on this, which is why I'm really pumped up about it, because I have been reading it for so long. Yeah?
How did he kill himself?
He jumped off a balcony. I mean, I guess not. I was gonna say they haven't written it yet. At this, he's kind of making some of the rules. So yeah, he jumps off of a very high building balcony because he just can't take it anymore, which is, yeah, one of the really interesting things about the end of this is he is the monster through a lot of it, but then he's also super sympathetic, and like they write him to be very, you know, he like hates himself because of his vampiric nature. He'll go on the attack and then have this total breakdown after it and hate the fact that this is why he's like this. He regrets what he does. And again, with some of the inconsistencies, at times we actually get chapters from his point of view, first person narration, so it says I, so instead of saying, you know, Varney did this, this is I did this. And so we actually get the inner look into his mind, and we don't get the first person point of view in vampire fiction after him, really, again, up until past World War II. So it really is pretty forward thinking in that way of actually letting us inhabit the mind of the vampire rather than just viewing them on a page. And yeah, at the end, he can't take it anymore and he takes his own life. We can argue whether that's done to kind of further this sympathetic vampire theme, or it was done because the publisher said it was done and so they needed to wrap it up. But again, I'm gonna read into it either way. That's kind of my job as an English scholar. I have to make a whole thing out of everything. But one of the many things that this story made kind of vampire canon because it was so long. But one of the things that I think is the most important is that this is where we get vampires having fangs. At no time before this in English literature do vampires explicitly have fangs mentioned or even sharp canines or anything of the sort. But here we have it mentioned, and we have it mentioned a lot. It's very important to his character, and it's very important to some of the, you know, detective work where they're looking at the wounds and they're looking at specifically like fang marks where they say no human teeth could have made that. And then since Varney, that becomes a staple of the horror genre with vampires. So I just think that's something so interesting, that something that becomes so influential to the vampires comes from this like little piece of trash TV soap opera fiction that, you know, we didn't even come back into scholarship or come back into importance until like the 1980s. And it was just kind of looked at as like, why would we study that? Like, that's not important. But I love Varney. It's a very fun read if you even just want to read a chapter just to say like, what was the tone of like your average Victorian person reading? It is so easy to read. My students are always so shocked at how this does not read at all like, you know, boring Victorian fiction. Literally starts off with on a dark and stormy night. Like, I promise you, you could read it in like 10 minutes before bed and just get a taste of it. But this is where we get a lot of our pop cultural conceptions of the vampire. A lot of them come from Varney. Then, of course, we have to talk about Dracula. I love Dracula so much, I really do. I've read it like 5 times. I could talk your ear off about it, but I'm also that person that's like, there's so much more to vampire literature of the time than Dracula, so I don't always focus on it. However, I do want to focus on it, and we'll do this similar kind of style of some vampire stories that mirror each other, that come out within a year of each other later in the history of this. So obviously we have Dracula, the vampire of all vampires. Bram Stoker wrote this in 1897. He was an Irish horror and mystery author. He continued to write after this and wrote a bunch before this. The book is written entirely in documents, which I think is an interesting thing to mention if you've never read it or kind of have been intimidated by it, because it is kind of long. It's like 500 pages or so. But it's easy to read because it's written in mainly diary entries. So it's written in this type of vernacular where they're not trying to be literary. Again, it's being written just how people of the time would speak, and it's 1897, so we're nearing some more modern language and things like that as well. So it's a cool, we call that an epistolary novel. And it's just a cool little thing that adds to some of Dracula's themes and things. I won't go on that huge tangent, but if you are interested, there has been a lot written about why Dracula was written, you know, in this way and not just as a novel. And then also, the very first page of the story, before we even get to prologue or anything, there's a preface that says that this is a true story. It insists that everything that you're about to read is the absolute fact, the absolute truth, that these are real diary entries, real ship logs, real everything. So I always kind of say that this is an early found footage horror, like Blair Witch Project, which is obviously a movie kind of thing, because there's no actual footage here. But it is continuing in this tradition of insisting that what you're reading is not really a story, even if you clearly know that it's a story. And a very famous myth that I would like to dispel is that Dracula is not based on Vlad the Impaler. Almost everyone thinks that or has heard that at some point, and that's totally just a myth that two scholars perpetuated because they thought it could be a thing, and so they said it and everyone believed them, and we have no proof. We have a lot of Bram Stoker's research on Dracula. He was kind of obsessed with writing this when he was writing this. There's a lot to look into the creation of Dracula and some kind of crazy theories about some American poets that we think he might have based Dracula on. It's like a whole thing. But he never mentions Vlad the Impaler, not even once in any of his research. And he did a ton of research into folkloric vampires and also just people in history to get his inspiration. So that's just totally made up. But that's a fun fact you can throw out now that you have in your itinerary. Now, getting to the more, who's the real monster all along in Dracula. There's a lot going on in Dracula, and we kind of jokingly can call Dracula a techno horror novel because at the time, again, we're talking 1897, we're entering a new century, and people are terrified. They're like, what does 1900 mean? Everything is happening so fast. We've got new technology across all fields, printing press, steam, the steam engine, textile trades, literally new technology in every single field that anyone can imagine. There's new expectations surrounding women's roles in society, among many other social things. Society and social expectations are changing. Specifically, in 1897, there's something called the New Woman, which was written about and feared. There literally were warning pamphlets of women riding bicycles and saying fear the new woman and things like that. So there was that to really scare you as well. Then there's new cultures and races coming to England due to expanding colonization, and not even just the colonizing, but this mix of cultures and going back and forth. So people from the places that England has colonized are coming to England, and there's a lot of anxiety about that. There's a lot of anxiety around the influence that those cultures are going to have on English culture. Also new scientific discoveries, evolution, the 1860s is when evolution is first kind of prompted as a theory, and then obviously the debates only raged from there, which evolution at the time also upended a lot of religious ideologies of the time, and also fears that we could revert back, because some of the thought was, well, if we evolved to get here, then can we also go backwards? And that prompted a lot of fear and depictions of monsters at the time, which is why a lot of Victorian monsters seem animal-like, because a lot of people are like, will that be us? If we revert, will that become us? Also germs, blood transfusions, all of the medical discoveries. So quite genuinely, it's a very scary time to be a person at this time because, again, they're trying to hold on so dearly to traditional Victorian culture, but also heading into a new century, and they cannot ignore these things. So all of these things are explored in Dracula. Of course, there is actually Dracula, who is a foreign man coming to England, and there's even there are some weird anagrams where there's many things in the novel where if you rearrange the letters, it says England or English and things like that. That's something that's very threaded throughout the novel, is what is England and what does it mean if someone outside of England encroaches on it and infects it with non-English things. It's all completely written in these diary entries that sometimes are written in shorthand, which was this new form of communication at the time that was seen as really hip and trendy. So it really is, not to be that English literature person, but it really is about more than the vampire in this case, I promise you. And which is what kind of makes it exciting, is because you can really tell that there's just so much going on, and I think that's way more fun to read than something that's trying to be so literary, something that's very clearly trying to make you anxious. This is making, especially at the time, the readers anxious, the writer anxious, and I think it works really well and is still really effective. However, on the other side of this coin, the same exact year, we also have a book called The Blood of the Vampire by Florence Marryat. Marryat, I always say she's the Victorian Stephen King, just in terms of how much she wrote. By the time that she died, she had written over 70 novels, I think, within a span of 25 years, including short stories. She was also a dog breeder and an opera singer and owned a newspaper and was an editor for a literary journal. So the woman got around. And so she was also incredibly popular. She didn't just write all these and nothing happened to them. She had, I will also say, I'm very biased towards her because I've done a lot of research on her. This book, actually, the first ever Penguin Classics edition of this book is coming out next October, and I wrote the introduction for it and notes on the text, so I'm very excited that it's finally getting published because she was so popular at the time. She had crazy fans. We have some of her fan letters where they will write to her and be like, oh, I'm just a little fan, but if you would respond with your signature, I will treasure it most ardently for the rest of time. And then she does, and then they write back and are like, are you kidding me? Like, I have your signature? That's amazing. So she loved her fans loved her. She was super popular, absolutely hated by the critics. Her, when she died, her obituary, the editor said, writer of many books, none of which were of much consequence to anyone. Yeah, like she was not liked, and she wrote to the critics. She knew what she wanted to write, and she wrote it regardless of if the critics liked it or not. So she kind of fell out of favor in academia and outside of scholarship, and only within the past maybe 5 to 10 years has anyone really started researching her again and kind of bringing her works back into the spotlight. But she wrote a vampire novel the same year that Dracula was published called The Blood of the Vampire. It was actually published before Dracula. It was published around May, as far as our records can concern. And this features a psychic vampire. So all the way back in 1897, way before What We Do in the Shadows or these more modern versions of the psychic vampire, we had a psychic vampire where it's not even me just trying to make a reach and trying to say like, oh, I'm just making this about vampires. It's literally in the title. It says Blood of the Vampire, and it's talked about how she is a vampire and how she gets it from her mother, and it's a hereditary genetic thing. However, she feeds off victims' life energy. So we basically follow this young woman who is newly independent. She's biracial. She lived in Jamaica, which was colonized, and she was able to be brought over. Her house burned down in Jamaica, and family tragedy sort of situation. So then she comes to England, but she's newly independent, so she's without any of her parents. She's freshly like 17 or 18, very young woman. She's biracial because of her mother, who was Jamaican, and she's literally just looking for friendship. It really starts off like a quintessential Victorian coming of age where she's visiting the city for the first time. She's just in awe of everything, wanting to make friends, kind of trying to find her place in the world. She's portrayed incredibly sympathetically. At no point are we to think she's a monster. She has this childlike wonder. It would be such a reach to read it and say that we're supposed to hate this young woman. And it really just becomes her tragedy, where everyone around her, when she starts to form a connection with them, they die. And it's never fully confirmed of if her vampirism is real. So once this starts happening, she goes to a doctor, and this doctor is this man that's he doesn't exactly have a great bedside manner, so we don't like him a lot, but he diagnoses her with vampirism. He tells her, oh, because of your mother, who was a voodoo witch in Jamaica, and she was a vampire, that means that you're a vampire and you're killing all your friends. And eventually she becomes engaged and has a fiance, but because he tells her, you are going to kill everyone you love, she thinks the only way to stop this is to kill herself. So she does, and then she writes this will where she leaves everything she has to all the people she's met throughout the novel. And we're kind of left to wonder, should she have, did she actually prevent anything, or was this kind of all just fabricated by this doctor, or how would we have even really known? So it's a really interesting work, also really short. I don't even know if it crosses 200 pages because, again, she's writing these things really, really quickly to get them out and publish them at a record rate. So it's super easy to read and both a quick read, but still has a lot of depth. It's not all just these adventures that she writes. But I just think it's really interesting that we have both of these types of vampires being published in the same year when basically everyone only just knows about Dracula. But now we will leave the 19th century behind, and we will get a little bit more modern. I will pause for 1 second and take a drink of water, and then we will get into the 20th century. All right. Again, I had to condense a lot down, so we're like really jumping around. We've got a lot of time to cover in this, but I just did it the best way I could. I was like, I've only got so much time, and you've only got so much of an attention span that I don't want to take up. So we are entering the 20th century. Again, we're going to look at two different novels that become very popular and are really influential to the modern rise of the vampire. Also, again, written within a year of each other. So first we have Stephen King, Salem's Lot, which was written in 1975. Briefly, this follows a human, Ben Mears, who returns to his hometown, Jerusalem's Lot, shortened to Salem's Lot, and discovers that the residents are turning into vampires. So what this really did, and kind of what its intervention was on the vampire genre of the time, is that it brought vampires to small-town America. Whereas before, vampires were very commonly, especially in Victorian fiction, the common trope was that they were coming to the city from outside of the city. It was that, we have this modern city that's got these modern values, and then the past, being this vampire that's from a non-city, an uncivilized place, comes into the city. Where here, now, Stephen King is looking at, and again, there's also some different cultural things going on at this time, because now we've moved to American fiction, but more generally, he's interested in bringing the vampire to suburbia, to small-town America, where small-town America is supposed to be this place that's the ultimate safety net. You don't have to lock your door, you can just have your kids go out and have a good time, not have to worry about anything bad happening. So his intervention into that horror is, what if you can't? What if now we have vampires here and they're taking over the town? So this is very similar to what John Carpenter's Halloween will do a few years later to the horror movie genre. So just in general, probably between the 70s to the mid-80s, in all of horror, we have a lot of suburban horror, a lot of horror that is asking that question of what happens when the monsters come home. And so this is participating in that. Here we have, traditionally though, the vampires being the antagonists, being the villains, being the bad guys in the stories. They're completely unsympathetic. They're monsters. They're encroaching on sacred small-town America. They are absolutely, without a doubt, the villains. We are not supposed to like them in any way. We want them vanquished. We have Barlow, who is the main vampire that kind of comes into town and starts all this. He's an Austrian immigrant, so he's not American, and he is an immigrant, again, coming from a different country, a different culture. Again, that follows that kind of traditional structure, very much mirroring what Dracula, okay, not Dracula, but Dracula did to England in 1897, where you have this foreigner coming in and disrupting the culture. However, what it kind of did in a nutshell, reimagined the classic vampire to 20th century America, really thinking through, okay, what actually would it be like if a vampire came here? They would target a small town in Maine, and the domino effect of that. Then, in just the next year, we have Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, which I did not actually know this until recently, that was her very first novel. Talk about a debut. Very impressive. But this follows vampire Louis de Pont-du-Lac telling his story to a reporter, hence Interview with the Vampire. Obviously, a lot happens in his life story, and kind of the real story of the novel is his life story, but just a quick bullet point of what we're kind of dealing with. And on the complete opposite side, again, written within, or at least published within months of each other, here we have the vampires being the protagonists. They're the main character that we are following, and they are sympathetic people that are struggling with their vampirism. We're making the monsters human now. We are getting into their life. We're seeing that they have a life, and that their life is sometimes a lot like ours and has struggles like ours. And this mirrors Marriott's attempts at humanizing the vampire. So again, we have this interesting deal where we have vampire books being published at the same time that are kind of doing mirrored things from each other, where this then, commonly, you will see this novel attributed to the rise of what we call the sympathetic vampire, the popular vampire, or the vampire that oftentimes we end up wanting to date at the end of the day. I think that's a totally fine thing to say, that this popularizes it, but I do want you all to remember that it's not the first. Sometimes people will say that, like, oh, it had never been done before Anne Rice, but it definitely had been done before Anne Rice. They just did not get as popular within scholarship. Also here within this novel, we have a long tradition of implicit queerness or implicit sexual ambiguity in one way or another that was in older vampire literature. This is made explicit or as explicit, as it could be in 1976, and is then made even more explicit in following adaptations, where we create this non-traditional vampire family unit, which is really at the core of this story. However, it's blurring the lines between, traditional representations of a mom, dad, and a child, especially when you talk about, well, the child's gonna be immortal forever. So there's interesting things dealing with both sexuality and how sexuality goes with the rearing of a family and family dynamics as well here. So here with Anne Rice, we have her reimagining vampires for a modern audience. And again, still this 20th century America sort of idea of modern audience, but she is kind of more tapping into the changing social landscape, changing of what could vampires do that we could actually put on page rather than kind of put behind closed doors or allude to, but not actually say. And then also, again, this changing social landscape of us perhaps looking for ourselves in the monster in a way that we couldn't say as explicitly in Victorian fiction or earlier. So now we have, going to another decade, I'm going forward another 10 years, we have the vampire on screen and for kids, question mark. So we have the vampire boyfriend, which, again, totally not a new phenomenon. A lot of times I will hear people or see people say vampires used to be scary, now they're just boyfriends. And I'm like, you guys, the Byronic vampire was literally meant to be a thing you wanted to date. It was just, again, making it explicit. He's always been desirable. I mean, Lord Rhythm at the very first vampire story, he's described as so charming and impeccably dressed, and he's so polite. I'm like, they all wanted to date him. We're just being explicit about it. So now, though, I will say there's definitely a difference in that a lot of the times we're supposed to be rooting for that relationship, not horrified by it, which is the very different type of relationship we're having to the characters, where we're seeing this as that's what we're watching for, is to see if they actually get together, not to see if he tears out her throat at the end. And interestingly, for the first time, we have the emergence of true codified young adult in book marketing. So there always have been books written for children or teens, people in the young adult area. Those have always been written, but they were not marketed as such. And it was not something that the publishing industry specifically was putting books out for that audience or selling them as such. Here they are, and vampire romance is in. This was when I grew up. I remember my mom taking me with Marilyn to go see the Twilight movies in theater when they were coming out, and I had all the books, and I was in 5th grade, I believe. And I know specifically because I would highlight all of our vocab words in Twilight, and I'd get little prizes, and then she had to say, Rachel, you read way more than anyone else in the class. You're getting all the prizes before anyone else can read. And I was like, okay, so I'm just gonna step back then. So very important for me, very influential for me. And again, you could do a whole other presentation and a whole other discussion on the history of that, the ethics of it, whether that was quote unquote good or bad, whatever. But it was exciting that these types of stories were being marketed to people my age for the very first time, especially to young women, where a lot of the times it would just be, quote unquote boy stories of adventures or whatever. So then just kind of a very quick some examples of some of these vampires on screen that have this audience for not children, but teens, younger adults. We have Buffy, which aired from 1997 to 2003. This subverts the traditional vampire victim being this young blonde girl, young blonde high schooler. She is now their slayer and eventually their girlfriend. Again, we have multiple vampire love interests. So here we also have some vampires that she is killing and some that she's kind of seeing the humanity behind. And then we have the Twilight Saga, based on the book series, which first started publishing in 2005, but these films did not start until 2008 through 2012. Follows an unassuming young girl who falls in love with a vampire and has to, deal with that fallout. And of course, the love in all of these has to be heart-wrenchingly dramatic. I mean, it has to be like so over the top, so this melodrama that you just like, you like hate it, but you also can't stop watching it. Which I mean makes sense, because if you're gonna go all out with a supernatural love story, it needs to hit hard. That's how you're gonna keep me watching. Then we have The Vampire Diaries, which aired from 2009 to 2017, also a TV series that was also based on a book series. However, these books were published first in 1991 and are very different from the show. I watched the show and I learned that they used to be books, so I went, of course I'm gonna read the books. And then I read the books and they are just, I mean, there's different supernatural creatures in the books that are not even in the show. They are not at all related in any way, shape, or form. But the base plot is there, which the base plot being a high school girl who this time she's caught between vampire brothers. There's 2 vampire brothers and she's in a love triangle between them. So it makes it even more dramatic. And actually, interestingly, I will say I've published on The Vampire Diaries. I've done narrative theory with it. There's some cool stuff going on there. And interestingly, you have the 2 brothers kind of representing these 2 different types of vampires, where you have one who is the more traditional Byronic vampire, who's dark, moody, struggling with his vampirism. And then you have one who seems a little bit more modern in the Anne Rice sense of not necessarily being so obviously bad, and seems like, oh, you're just like a good guy that drinks blood sometimes. So you kind of have that intersection of the past and the present on the different types of vampires we see as well. But all of these shows, and also any of the ones that I could think of that I could also put in here, all of these shows both show good and bad vampires, which is really interesting, whereas some of these books, it's pretty one to the other. Like with Anne Rice, we're looking at these vampires and how they're trying to be human. Salem's Lot, they're pretty bad. Dracula, the vampire's bad. All of these TV series have the space to really explore that you have both. And, you know, definitely wasn't for kids, but the Sookie Stackhouse True Blood series, again, I was kind of in the whole like for teens section, so I didn't want to just randomly have the offshoot. But in that series as well, we have vampires that are considered to be good and helpful and, you know, trying to be better, and then also vampires that are just bad people. And a lot of time that goodness or badness is based on how much they do or do not deny their vampirism, how much they enjoy being a vampire. If they enjoy it too much, if they enjoy the bloodlust, if they enjoy the killing, that's a bad vampire. If they're trying to resist it, if they're trying to, in the words of Twilight, be vegetarian and only drink from animals, then they're seen as good, which I find really interesting, of that kind of how do we deal with vampire morality. And then all of them, including True Blood, also have a human girl and a vampire man main relationship dynamic. Of course, there's lots of drama throughout, and whoever she settles with, whatever, but the main entry point into the story is this question of what if a human falls for a vampire. So again, that's kind of what I grew up with and what got me into watching all these vampire stories and things. But where does that leave us? Where are we at today? Which is a crazy question to ask now, because, you know, my PhDs took me 6 years. So when the time I started looking at vampires, we're in a really different state with vampires, where it seems like in the past, like, maybe 2 or 3 years, they've like exploded. Like all of a sudden I'm like, I don't even know what to talk about here, because it seems like we're back. There's like a vampire renaissance, which is really exciting for me, but also like, oh my God, why did that happen? Like, come on guys, you're late, I've been here this whole time. But just some things that I've noticed. Also, let's do a quick time check. Let's see, 7:51, okay, yeah, I can do that. This is my last slide. Just to look towards the future and kind of where we're at with vampires. The biggest thing that I want to mention that just seems to be across the board, no matter what the actual plot of the vampire thing is, again, whether it's in books, movies, TV, whatever, there's so much more diversity in just who gets to be a vampire. There's way more female vampires. There's more explicitly gay vampires exploring that queerness, again, like Anne Rice did, but even more explicitly, or that kind of almost being the point of the novel. There's more vampires from different cultures. They're not all white English. And there's more vampires from different races. One very recently that looks at vampires through a history of Black culture and Black music specifically is Sinners, which was fantastic, and again shows that the versatility of vampires can really be molded to many different things, many different cultures, and many different histories. There's also, interestingly, a trend of retellings or reimaginings of classic vampire works. These are just a couple published within the past, I think all of these have been published within the past 2-3 years. A Dowry of Blood is a retelling of Dracula from Dracula's bride's perspective. It's like one scene in Dracula that has Dracula's brides in it. So they take that scene and write a whole novel about it and ask, what if all those wives were being abused? How would they think through and go through being abused by Dracula, and look at domestic violence. Hungerstone by Kat Dunn is a reimagining retelling of Carmilla, which I didn't talk about here, but is kind of touted as the first lesbian vampire text in 1872. So this is a retelling of that. There's been a couple retellings of Carmilla. There's been a lot of renewed interest in Carmilla and making, again, some of that queerness more explicit. There's Lucy Undying, which is Lucy, who is one of the main characters of Dracula, follows her story, and not to spoil her fate in Dracula, but it asks if she got a different ending, what that would be like. There was the Renfield film, which was not a super serious film, but I mean, it was looking at this modern reimagining of the relationship between Dracula and his minion Renfield. There's just been a lot of callbacks, a lot of return, reimagining, retelling, rather than make a whole new vampire, the question of asking what would happen if this vampire was in our current world. Also, like the vampire likes to do, it invades, and it's been invading other genres rather than just being horror. We've got comedy. I've mentioned What We Do in the Shadows was a film, and then it was adapted or readapted into a TV show. I deeply, deeply love it. I think it is great for people who love vampires or even don't love vampires, because there's a lot of callbacks and things, Easter eggs that you'll notice if you're in the know, but if you're not, it's still a super fun show. And each one of the housemates, because it follows a house of vampires, and each one of the roommates or housemates kind of represents a different archetypal vampire. So you've got the Byronic vampire, then you've got the kind of Dracula vampire, the energy vampire. So there's different types of vampire lore going on there that I actually think is really, really well done. Also, not just romance, but specifically romance and erotica. We've got Bride by Ali Hazelwood, which is, again, a recently published novel that follows a romance between a vampire and a werewolf, and it very much explicitly goes into the sexual nature of that, so it's not just about the romance, but we're edging into this growing genre of monster romance where the romance and the erotic nature comes from the monster itself. Then we've got romantasy, which is romance in a fantasy setting, a genre that, again, has only really become its own thing within the past 2 years, but vampires are abound in the romantasy genre. So just a one to mention, The Serpent and the Wings of Night, which is one that got pretty big, but a lot of times the fantasy setting includes some sort of paranormal creature, and a lot of times that paranormal creature is a vampire, and then there's, it's like 2/3 a fantasy plot with like 1/3 romance thrown in. Then we've also got literary fiction. This is a really big one that I admittedly haven't read a ton from, just because I'm like, I want the good stuff. I want the stuff that people think's bad. I don't really care if it's literary, but there has been a lot of literary fiction dealing with vampires, except the vampires are not super explicit in it. Again, so Women Eating by Claire Coda is really about this biracial woman dealing with her own cultural identity and her identity with her family, but she also is a vampire, so it's used much more metaphorically and much more used to explore other things rather than actual vampirism. And my big question that I always ask and that I just don't have an answer for is the vampire still scary, and can it ever be again? I actually just asked my class this last week, and the overwhelming opinion of Gen Z, at least, is no. It seems that it's just gone to such a point where it's morphed itself, for better or for worse, into so many other genres that, sure, it can still create anxiety and tension and suspense, but the actual figure of the vampire just does not seem scary anymore. I bring up Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, which he talked explicitly about this problem in vampire, problem in quotes, and that he was trying to make the vampire scary again in this movie. And I think it worked to a point, but there were still a lot of people on Twitter being like, he's supposed to be scary, but why do I find him kind of hot? Are we past the point of no return? I don't know if it's possible anymore. So that's something that I'm just really interested in it. If someone says like, oh no, I've got like a really scary vampire for you, I'm like, oh, I have to see it then because, yeah,
It's a book with the Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Caña.
I literally bought that yesterday.
Did you? Oh
Yes.
my God. Because everybody's talking about the Buffalo Hunter. And I'm telling you, this book came first.
Yeah.
Just a couple years ago. But it's in a triangle. Like when you teach a class, centers of the Buffalo Hunter.
Okay, well that makes me even more excited about it now because her new book came out and I was like, well, I felt like I had to read her vampire work first. I was like, if I'm interested in your new work.
That's the first, I think, no, it's the second one, but you're gonna like it.
Well, that's incredible. That's great. And now I guess I don't have any beautiful way to wrap this up other than to say that's all I've got. But I am more than happy to take questions, comments, anything. I believe we have another microphone that we can pass around. If you do have questions or comments, if you have a really scary vampire that you need to add to my list. But thank you so much for listening to me babble. If you want to reach out to me in my email, you can also just look me up. I'm on OSU's English department website, stewart.1593@osu.edu. Literally, if you have anything to say, I would be happy to hear from you and chat with you and yap at you. The fact that I got asked to do this, I was like, I am living my dream. I love just talking about vampires and people listen to me. It's crazy. So thank you so much for being here with me and spending your evening with me. It was awesome. So yeah, if anyone has...
There was an online question.
Yeah.
A person, like right when you started, they said, do you think vampires have bad breath?
Ooh.
What's a vampire's breath smell like? I didn't know if there was anything written down about that.
Okay, yes, there is actually. One of the things is, depending on how the vampire becomes a vampire, it has been mentioned in different stories that it smells really bad because they're like dead, because their body is dead, and if they're like a walking corpse, then it has been mentioned explicitly that like their breath also smells like a corpse, which is not great. So I haven't heard any of them smelling good. I've only heard of them smelling bad, but if you know any vampires with really good breath, send them to me. I would be happy to be an eyewitness. I almost mentioned that one too. There's been a lot of, yes, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the new, if you've watched it, the new Interview with the Vampire series?
Okay, so my biggest confession as a vampire scholar is that I have never interacted with a single piece of Anne Rice media. I just lectured to you all about Interview with the Vampire. I've never read a single page of it. I have nothing against them. I just like my journey did not lead me there. And so I don't know, I read like everything else so that by the time I had that, it was such a blind spot that I almost felt like now I'm like scared of it. And I can't tell you the number of people that texted me when she died and they were like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, like Anne Rice died. And I was like, I'm so glad that when a vampire author dies, you think of me. But I haven't even read any of her stuff. But I've heard amazing things, and everything that I've seen is really cool, and I've had some students write their final papers on it, and those have been really great, so I can secondhand say that I think it's great.
Okay, I have one more question we can end on here. What's your favorite depiction of vampires, books or cinema?
Oh, the favorites question. Those ones are so hard. I mean, okay, if I'm just gonna be straight up honest, like it's gonna be Buffy and the Vampire Diaries. But that's just because, I mean, that's like my heart. Like that's why I'm here, is because I watched those shows and fell so deeply in love with them and felt like I had this voracious hunger for the creature and I couldn't get enough. So like that's what I literally owe it all to. I mean, I just rewatched the Scooby-Doo movie yesterday that has the Hex Girls in it, and you know, the Thorn, she's the vampire lead singer. Like those kind of cheesy depictions I think are actually my favorite because, again, they speak to like, why did they get so popular? Why are these the ones that endure through time? So I think those are my favorites, as cheesy as it sounds. I think we had, I was gonna say that you had.
I had a theory that with all of the dystopia movies about zombies and vampires, that one, the vampire is viewed as maybe the horror of the aristocrat, and then the zombies coming in mobs is the horror of the lower order. Do you think there's any merit to this theory?
Oh, do I think there's any merit? You just tapped on a actual pretty large academic theory. That is when I have a little bit more time to teach these creatures, because I do teach a monsters course, I teach the monsters and the vampires together because that is exactly what has been theorized. Specifically, Karl Marx has a quote that literally says that aristocrats are vampires. So, all the way back again to the 19th century, we've had that kind of idea of capital and capitalism being this sucking force, whereas then consumerism causes these mindless zombies, things like that. We see that especially in, I think it's the second one of Night of the Living Dead, where it's in the mall. That's something that's pointed to a lot to kind of look at this mass consumerism zombie theory. But you are absolutely right, and I could go on a lot more about that topic. So I would say Google it, and you will find a lot of people talking more about that.
How do your medical history studies connect to this?
Oh, you've asked the question that will get me going. I'm like, that's my whole dissertation. So currently, right now, my current chapter is looking at that. And there were a lot of discoveries in what the blood means scientifically for the body. And so one thing that I find really interesting that I didn't put in here, but that I always like to kind of talk about that people might not know about, is that when you're reading a Victorian work and there is a scene of a vampire drinking blood from someone, that is a sex scene. That is absolutely a sex scene, because the blood at that time, blood was seen to be your life force. It was seen to be just as much as any other bodily fluid as identifying, and blood transfusions, legitimate medical blood transfusions, could only occur between married couples because of that belief. They really thought that exchanging of bodily fluids was akin to sex. So that's why the scenes in Dracula like that, people read it and they're like, am I weird for thinking that was written a bit sexually? I'm like, no, you are not. That is exactly what they meant. But that's one of the really big ones. Another one is, I mentioned earlier that I've been looking through some anti-vaccination pamphlets. So the vampire was also used as a figure either against vaccination, to say, you get vaccinated, it's like letting a vampire take your blood or whatever, the misunderstanding of what a vaccine actually is or what it's doing. But a lot of those things of not understanding what exactly we're learning scientifically goes into the monster, because a lot of it is weird and you're not really sure what to make of it, and Victorian doctors don't exactly have the best way to make it understandable to people at the time. So there's a lot more there, but I know we're running a little bit late, so I won't fully go in. Those are just a couple of them.
My question's about, so you're doing your dissertation, is that what you said? Mm-hmm. During your studies, you mentioned during the presentation that, will vampires be scary again? So I'm wondering, during the time of your studies, and I've been for the last 3 minutes, trying to figure out how to word this question, is that, is there, what would it take to make the vampire scary again? Because in the beginning with the Bela Lugosi era, the vampire and vampirism is always a metaphor for something else that's going on in society.
Yes.
So what would it take in society to push vampires back into being really scary instead of Twilight teen romance kind of thing?
That is
what
the
is
golden
happening
question.
now?
That is the question that I'm asking and that I ask myself all the time. And I talk about it, again, when I said that I talked about it with my students recently, they discussed the look of the vampire and saying we needed more vampires that looked less human, so that looked more monstrous, which I can definitely see. But I feel like my taste in horror is so weird because I don't actually like to be scared. I don't actually like to watch horror that scares me. So, that's why I have never, I've never found vampires actually scary. I've just been entranced by them. So I've never actually been scared by one myself. So I feel like the things that would scare me would not, I mean, a vampire slasher, I think home invasions are scary. So I feel like there would have to be this more realistic element. I think supernatural is harder to be scared of for me. So I don't know, that's what I would think. I love Let the Right One In is both a great book and a great movie. I've seen both adaptations. There's an American version and an original version. I want to say Dutch? Swedish, yes. And I think that's the most disturbing vampire that I've seen. It content exposure. If you don't want to read about pedophilia, don't read it. But that is one of the large concepts that it deals with in terms of what do you do with a child vampire and what are some of the sinister possibilities of a child who's in the body of a child but 1,000 years old or whatever. I definitely think that's the most disturbing. I hadn't even been thinking of that one, but that's a really good point of, yeah, maybe it's not the vampire itself, but the content that then goes into the rest of the story and kind of that the vampire participates in. Yeah, that one's a hard read, but it's so good. All right. I will release you all. But thank you again. This was so much fun. Thank you for coming out. I hope you have a good rest of your night. You read some vampire fiction or watch a vampire movie or something. And if you find a vampire that scares you, email me.